Thanks very much for the invitation to join you today. And I'd like to thank Laura, Soil Association Scotland and City of Edinburgh Council for being kind enough to issue the invitation. What I'd really like to do is to share with you some thoughts of some cities that we've been working with over the last 10 years. And it reminded me when I was travelling up here last night, that every time I started a new phase of this work on sustainable cities, I've ended up starting it with the Soil Association. And this work first started back in 12 years ago, I guess, when we first started working with the Soil Association to explore the role of public procurement in shaping sustainable food systems. I thought I was embarking on a project then for about 6 months, and 8 years later I was still working on school food reform with them. Ended up writing a book about it, in which Scotland, of course, featured very prominently because we featured the work of Robbie Goulet, what he was doing in East Ayrshire. And I used to say to people, you know, when they would say to me, you're featuring Scotland in a work on best practice, isn't that the land of the fried Mars bar and stereotypes like this? And I would say, well, maybe it is, but it's also the land of hungry for success. And in our book, we argued, you know, that the school food revolution in Britain began not on a TV set in London, but in the public sphere in Scotland. And I think that's very, very important, because there's a big issue in that story, I think. It's that while food cultures don't change overnight, nor are they set in aspic. Food cultures can change if they are designed with communities, and where communities are involved in their own transformation. And that's a simple point, but it's a profoundly important point in terms of the way in which we think about designing sustainable food systems. So what I want to do in the next 15 minutes or so is roughly run through the agenda to try to suggest to you why food is suddenly becoming visible to mainstream politicians, having been seen as some kind of idiosyncratic, fluffy, green, hippie-ish agenda on the margins of society. I think the food agenda is moving mainstream in all serious cities around the world, both in the global north and in the global south. So I'll run through these little cook's tour of what's going on in these cities, and then try to end up on the key issues facing us all, whether we live in cities, rural areas, or wherever. So, food has moved up the agenda for many, many reasons. I'm not going to run through all these. The important point, I think, about this slide is that it shows us that people come to food from many, many, many different sources. Food has a multifunctional quality, a multidimensional quality that no other issue that I've ever worked on possesses. And this is why we talk about the convening power of food. Food can bring people together from all walks of life, and I'll come back to that right at the end, because it's a very, very important issue. You can come at it from health, social justice, ecology, whatever. But of course, there's the last issue, as Laura said, as David mentioned, the local food agenda. Food very often gets framed in doom and gloom terms, carbon footprints, food deserts, so on and so forth. And we tend to forget sometimes that food is also associated with place, with provenance, and above all, of course, with pleasure. And we should never forget about the joys of food. Food bringing people together at the table, building communities and building social capital. So there's no one theme about food. You can come to food from many, many areas. And that's why it's gone up the agenda. Sad to say, the reason politicians have really got it is because food security has become synonymous with national security. Since the food price spike in 2007, we've had scores of cities around the world literally erupting, posing major problems of political security. And that's why the G8, now the G20, had its first agriculture conference. The first time in the G8 history was held since the price spikes. So suddenly, mainstream politicians are getting the food message, and we shouldn't forget that, nor should we apologise for it. So, what are cities doing about it? Let me run through North America, Africa, and come back to Europe, and then the UK. In North America, food planning is one of the fastest growing social movements in North America. Working in a school of city and regional planning, I have to say mea culpa here, because planners simply have failed to get the food message until recently. The American Planning Association began this process of compensating for this neglect in 2005, and in its famous report now called Community Food Planning. And that report begins by saying that planners have dealt with all the essentials of human life, air, water, land, shelter, with a conspicuous absence of food. Planners have signally failed to address food. Urban planners now. Lots of reasons for that. They've assumed it's a rural issue. They've assumed the market will deal with it. They've assumed where street food has appeared in the north or the south of the globe, they've assumed these people need to be harassed off the street, creating big problems of food security in the global south, as I'll show in a moment. But since then, we've seen an explosion of food policy councils in cities, in counties and in states. Food policy councils, basically where the local state gets together with local civil society and begins to think of creating a sustainable city through the prism of food. Because food drives all these other issues that I mentioned earlier: water, energy, land, health, and so on and so forth. So food policy councils are a very exciting way of thinking about cities, as I said, through the prism, through the lens of food. And I just very briefly want to go through these. I guess the key point is that cities frame food in slightly different terms, depending on their own interests, depending on their own political concerns. There's no doubt about it that food has been driven by public health in New York. Everybody knows about the green cart movement in New York, where Mayor Bloomberg is licensing green carts, healthy fruit and vegetables in underserved areas, what we used to call food deserts. But that's only one part of a more holistic strategy to think about the food system as an urban system in holistic terms, running from production to post-consumption recycling. It's a very, very exciting program, New York's Food Works model. Seattle does much the same. It tries to develop a local strategy for the city, but doing it not as some kind of urban prima donna, but doing it with its rural hinterland. The urban and the rural are linked here in trying to create a shared destiny, overcoming the old days when cities were simply parasites on the rural hinterland. It's a matter of building the interdependence between the two, not just for food production, but to address these wider issues of race and social justice as well. San Francisco, I think, has probably, on paper, the most holistic strategy of all, covering pretty much every aspect that food touches, which, as I say, is pretty much everything, because food, I think, has a unique status. And then we come to Toronto in Canada. I mention this because I think it's probably the most innovative food policy council that I've ever worked with. Wayne Roberts, who recently retired as the director, was a pretty unique food activist and politician himself. Why? Because instead of trying to create a new food department, trying to create new turf for food, he went to each existing department to show how food could help each department meet its own targets, whether it was transport, public health, social justice, environment, energy. He embedded food in other people's agendas, and a very, very important political implication flows from that, because you're helping others to help themselves instead of building your own turf, as it were. In Africa, where we've been working with Kampala and Dar es Salaam, urban planners have really been part of the problem in Africa rather than part of the solution. Why? Because they've had a European idea of a city in their minds, that agriculture has no part of a, quote, modern city, and therefore food vendors, street vendors, urban farmers, 75% of whom are women, by the way, have been harassed off the street because they don't have some kind of modern role in a modern city. That's been a big part of the problem. Whereas the real agenda for planners ought to have been to find these women safe places to sell, access to fresh water for hygiene, and so on and so forth. Some planners are now becoming part of the solution instead of part of the problem. And I think in Kampala and Dar es Salaam, in some parts of Nairobi, this is beginning to happen. Street food is absolutely vital for urban food security. Latin America, sorry this is a cook's tour, but we can discuss them later. Bello is probably the best example of an urban food security strategy that I've seen anywhere in the world. This is a strong city in a strong federal system. So a city uses the programs, federal programs, for me Zero Hunger and Bolsa Familia is an income support net, allowing families to afford food. Food isn't just about the availability of food, it's about access to food. We should never forget, the great Amata Sen's great insight about famines. That a famine is where lots of people don't have enough food to eat. It's not about there being not enough food. It's an absolutely simple point, but it's a profound point. You can have lots of food in an area, but if people can't access it, you can have a famine. Bello has demonstrated it can overcome these things with a community-led food strategy. Now it's called the city that abolished hunger. I can't think of a higher accolade for any city. Closer to home, we can see, these are the examples we know perhaps much better. Rome led the quality food revolution. In our book on the school food revolution, no offence, Robin, I know East Ayrshire was great, but Rome was maybe a little bit better at one point. But you sustained it, Rome didn't. They have a very right-wing mayor has come into Rome and he's unpicking the best school food system that we've ever seen. London launched with a grand strategy. It's got some of it left, but when Ken was defeated, we thought Boris would abolish the strategy. But he didn't. But he showed how mayors can frame food differently. For Ken, if you wanted to talk about food, you had to press his button, which was health. He wouldn't talk about food unless you framed it in terms of public health. If you mention public health to Boris, he goes to sleep. Boris is all about the green city, growing schemes, capital growth. So you've got to press that green button with him. And when we deal with politicians, as we know, they've all got their buttons. And we need to be well informed to know what those buttons are. We need to raise our game on this. Amsterdam copied London. And again, the strategy looked good on paper, but it collapsed. Why? Because it was a top-down strategy through the deputy mayor. When she left, the strategy collapsed. And that's why it's not just designing these strategies, it's implementing and building a coalition in civil society to allow a city to sustain these strategies, whoever comes into office. So all these cities, in my view, have regressed. That's not a popular message to put in London, by the way.